Welcome to the National Press Foundation. We're coming to you from the Evelyn Y. Davis studios. I'm Chris Adams, Director of Training for NPF. Today, we're looking at real-world evidence and how it could factor into drug and device approvals. The basic question is this: does real-world evidence contribute reliable information to medical decision-making, or is moving away from the randomized controlled trial a mistake because it's weakening standards? This is happening in the age of big data, when medical information is everywhere, in your electronic health record, on your wristwatch and smartphone, and in your hospital and pharmacy records. We'd like to thank our sponsor, ISPOR, which is the Professional Society for Health Economics and Outcomes Research, and which had support from the BMS-Pfizer Alliance. Today, we're looking at real-world evidence and how it could factor into drug and device approvals. And so we're thrilled to have as our kickoff speaker, Dr. Mark McClellan. He's the Robert J. Margolis Professor of Business, Medicine, and Policy, and founding director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University. He's also a former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, a former administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, a former senior director for healthcare policy at the White House, and a former deputy assistant secretary for economic policy at the Treasury Department. He's going to give us an overview of the real-world evidence debate. It's a little after 9 right now. He's going till 9:50, and he's going to present, and then we'll have time for questions. So Dr. McClellan, I'd like to thank you for coming and welcome you and turn the floor over to you.
Chris, thanks very much. It's great to be with you all today. And I want to thank the National Press Foundation for putting this together, especially thank all the participants. Being a health reporter is a real challenge these days. The issues are complicated. There's more politics involved than ever before, but they are more important than ever before. And real world evidence for decision making is a great example of that. Also want to disclose that in addition to running the Duke Margolis Center, which is a university-wide program at Duke, we also have a big office in Washington, D.C., and we do a lot of work in this space of kind of complex healthcare policy issues that affect medical technology and our healthcare costs and our health outcomes. We welcome you contacting us at any time. I've got all my contact information at the back end of these slides. I'm also an independent director at on the boards of Alignment Healthcare, Cigna, Johnson & Johnson, and Prognom IQ. So my next slide. The reason that real world evidence is getting more and more important is that the way that healthcare works is getting more and more complex with more and more treatments being developed. We're basically moving from the lower right of this graph to the towards the top left. So a lot of healthcare used to be reactive. People had complications. We try to treat those, but we had many diseases that did not have effective therapies, leading to death, leading to declines in function, leading to the need for supportive care. Over the last 5 decades or more, we've seen more and more diseases move upstream. So more definitive treatments that can intercept diseases and cure them. Think about what's happened with many cancers and other conditions, more earlier and more accurate diagnosis. And that's really beginning to shift too with blood-based multi-cancer tests and all the omics going on now, leading to the point where with interventions like gene therapies or very effective medical devices to replace organ function and the like, we can get up to the top left, focusing on things like prevention and getting at root causes of health problems. But along the way, treatments have gotten more complex. Most cancers now involve multiple drugs and an understanding of people's genetic profiles as well as other factors, maybe proteomics and the like. And that means that the evidence that we need to go along with these treatments has gotten more complex and much more personalized as well. Not only that, if we're talking about early interventions that would do things like catch a cancer before it progresses very far, you really want to have long-term follow-up of patients and many different types of patients who may have different preferences to get a good understanding of, does that treatment really work as well as we think? You know, the gene therapy sounds good, but so far they haven't been perfect. They don't necessarily last for many years. Every single patient doesn't necessarily have a long-term response. And those are all questions that can be very hard to answer through traditional clinical trials alone. So on the next slide, That's led to an interest in real world data and real world evidence. And the goal with these approaches is to augment what we can do through traditional special clinical trials that are set up outside of routine healthcare. This is also driven by the fact that health data has gotten a lot more electronic. And again, the fact that there are these more and more diverse kinds of questions that we'd like to answer about combinations of treatments, about comparing one treatment to another, about long-term outcomes that matter to patients that may be hard to capture in a traditional clinical trial. It's too costly. It's not possible to keep those trials running as long as we might like. So real-world evidence can potentially really help fill evidence gaps. Next slide. And again, there's so much healthcare data, and there's going to be a lot more. So this is a simple summary of the healthcare data ecosystem with data coming on medical products as they're in development, supply chain shortages, things like that, data coming on different kinds of sources of information that are relevant to decisions that patients and their providers make, lab tests, electronic medical records, imaging, et cetera. But increasingly, patient-generated data, wearables, information gathered from home, information that patients report about how they're doing, increasingly important, as well as health insurance claims and data from other consumer companies that are increasingly engaged in healthcare as well. So that's a huge amount of data that could inform care for understandable reasons. It's fragmented, privacy protections and the like, different business models and so forth. But it's a vast amount of information that could be a basis for better evidence. And for all the reasons I mentioned, we need more evidence than ever so we can get the most out of medical technologies and avoid unnecessary costs. On the next slide. So we did a study not that long ago, this was published earlier this year, of how is real world evidence being used, at least in one important application, that's regulatory uses for FDA decisions. Now, there's been long-term use of real world data and real world evidence for what's called safety surveillance. So looking at medical products, whether it's vaccines or surgical devices or drugs, when they're on the market to see if they have unusual side effects that wouldn't be expected to occur in large populations. That's one reason we've got data on the safety of the COVID vaccines across literally experience with tens, if not hundreds of millions of patients. So that's been a traditional use of real world evidence. Where it hasn't been used as much as for questions about effectiveness and for drug approvals or for new indications. What we found on the next slide it really hasn't been used all that much. So we looked 1950 to mid 2020, and out of all that time, when there have been literally hundreds, if not thousands, of drug approvals and major actions on new molecular entities, we found a total of 34 uses of real world evidence for cases that weren't only for safety reporting. And those occurred in a subset of areas for rare conditions and so-called orphan drugs with small populations in either cancer or hematology. That also includes a lot of blood-related cancers or some neurologic conditions, especially rare genetic diseases. Of these, 60% of the real-world evidence was included on the label, and these were for alternatives to randomized clinical trials, so-called single-arm trials, where you follow a population of patients who are treated and maybe compare them to a similar population from the past, where you had this real-world data on how the patients did. And so there were a number of reasons why studies that had sought to use this evidence wasn't included. Questions about the reliability of the data, questions about the relevance and the quality of the methods that were used to analyze the data. So what we concluded, and what this talk is about, is that broader use of real world data and real world evidence is going to require careful attention to whether the data and the methods are fit for purpose, and some more intentional efforts to develop and learn from promising examples and uses. So all of those petabytes of data that are literally being generated on an ongoing basis in healthcare now, not very many applications yet, but I think for reasons I talked about in my introduction, a lot of interest in trying to expand this and do it right. The next slide. So what I'm going to talk about in my remarks is real world data and real world evidence, what it is and why and how it's being applied, and then some of the steps that are being undertaken now to try to advance the data and the methods and the infrastructure to support turning all of this data that's out there, the growing amount, into evidence that we can really count on. This is not straightforward, so it fits into your usual beat of having to deal with complex topics, but there are some important principles that you can apply, and this is a very important set of issues for people to understand, since you're going to be seeing a lot of so-called real-world evidence-based studies going forward. I'll talk a little bit about COVID-19 applications along the way. In my comments, I'm going to talk, in my slides, I've got sort of a whole comprehensive assessment of how real world evidence is used. I'll talk about this more in a second. Not going to get through all of that in my remarks, but at least you've got a framework and know where to go and some applications to the very important FDA related issues that you're covering. So on to the next slide. So key terms, real world data is data related to patient health status and the delivery of care that is routinely collected in the course of delivering patient care. So that, again, that is a massive amount of data now. Of course, it includes electronic records and health insurance claims, but it also includes many organizations now track how their patients are doing because they're increasingly being held accountable for the outcomes for the patient populations and the costs. You know, think about accountable care organizations and also just health system interest in quality improvements. So a set of registries for different kinds of patients, again, for use of improving care, mobile apps, digital technologies, wearables, other forms of patient-generated data. That's the data. That's kind of the raw materials. Real-world evidence is evidence derived from real-world data through the application of research methods. This includes clinical evidence regarding the use and potential benefits and risks of a medical product. That's the examples that I just described. But it also includes a range of other uses outside of and maybe complementary to FDA regulatory decisions. And like I said, I'm going to touch on some of those examples. Next slide. And really you can think about real world evidence being relevant, potentially relevant, if we can get it right, throughout the whole life cycle of medical products. So number two, regulatory review. That's what people tend to think of. So is this being used in an FDA regulatory decision? As I said, that's actually been one of the lesser uses of real world evidence aside from safety questions up to now. More common is use in some of these other categories, particularly 1 and 3. Category 1 is medical product development. So how are you thinking about designing a clinical trial or a clinical development program? Well, you can learn a lot, maybe not enough for a regulatory decision, but you can learn a lot about which patients may be responding to a condition, which may be having complications from tracking these observational studies of patients in actual practice. It can help you identify where the biggest complications are occurring, the most unmet medical need exists out there. That's behind a lot of studies that you've seen on, say, the burden of Alzheimer's disease, or the burden of many other health care conditions where we don't have the ideal treatments that we'd like to have. We haven't moved up into that top left corner, as I showed you earlier. And it can also help with designing the clinical trials and give you an idea of how often you'd expect adverse events to occur in a population that you're studying in a clinical trial, so that you can select the right combinations of patients and have a lot of confidence that if the treatment really works in a randomized clinical trial, you'll be able to detect an effect. I've talked a little bit about regulatory review so far. The uses have been in rare diseases where it's hard to set up a big enough study and follow patients for long enough to do a traditional randomized randomized clinical trial. We're also starting to see more uses for labeled indications beyond the key indication that gets a product approved. So as I talked about earlier, questions about longer term impacts, questions about effects in different subgroups of patients, comparative effectiveness, whether a treatment is better or not than another. Those are harder to do in traditional clinical trials, and there's a lot of interest in whether real world data, real world evidence methods are valid enough to get to those kinds of questions too. And of course, post-market safety is a common use. And this third category is also a very common use of real world data and real world evidence, and that is how do we improve care delivery? There's a huge amount of work going on now to use big data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence to help augment that treatment combinations that patients get in real world practice, figure out what treatments go best together for them, how to maybe use a particular technology or combination of technologies as part of a care model to help patients get more engaged in care. So digital apps, so digital therapeutics, as people call them, becoming much more commonly used in care. All those are based off of real world data. And some of these same questions apply. Are those, they look like they're improving outcomes for patients, but can we really be confident or that the methods underlying them appropriate? And finally, as we've seen rising healthcare costs with all of these technologies that hold the promise of changing the course of disease, of intervening early, of maybe being targeted well, a lot more interest in the use of real world evidence on coverage decisions and payments. Some of you may have heard of Coverage with Evidence Development, a program that I worked on at CMS along with others to help Medicare find ways to answer questions that are very important for whether a medical treatment is reasonable and necessary, the Medicare standard for coverage, which is not the same thing as whether a treatment is safe and effective, which is the FDA standard for approval. Methods for payment that may depend on developing further evidence, also methods for payments that may depend on actual outcomes for treatments that are approved under accelerated approval, for example. This is a way of de-risking the uncertainty about the long-term effects or the confirmed effects of those treatments when they're approved. So it's a pathway for access, but sharing the financial risk until the results are known by having an outcomes-based contract, sharing the financial risk with the manufacturer instead of putting it all on the payers or the government. And so a lot of interest in those areas as well. Like I said, there's a lot on that in the slides. I'm not going to get to most of that in my remarks, but for those who are interested, we're doing a lot of work in this area and glad to follow up. Next slide. A lot of reasons why real world evidence might be useful. I've touched on many of these: confirmatory evidence, answering questions that are hard to do in traditional randomized clinical trials, more information on subgroups of patients, improved ways of using treatments as part of actual practice patterns in medical practice, confirming for payers that the suspected benefits are really there in the long term in actual clinical practice, in particular subgroups of patients. And of course, for patients, all this means is better treatment decisions and getting the best outcome at the lowest cost. Next slide. This has been an area of a lot of interest. So even though there's been limited use beyond safety so far, strong bipartisan interest in the previous Prescription Drug User Fee Act and the 21st Century Cures legislation. By the way, now there's a 21st Century Cures 2.0 in process, which has a lot of activity related to a lot of proposals, provisions related to real world data and real world evidence, including on the post-market side. So those supporting those confirmatory studies, interactions with coverage and payment and the like. So lots of interest in encouraging FDA to help develop this space. Next slide. And a lot of reasons for this because of some of the challenges with clinical trials. This is an example from COVID. So the U.S. has been, unfortunately, the world's #1 supplier of COVID patients over the last year and a half. But out of all of those patients, only about a fraction of 1% were able to enroll in a clinical trial that was registered with clinicaltrials.gov. And of those trials, only about 5%, according to this analysis published earlier this year that included some data reviewed by FDA, only about 5% of those COVID trial arms yielded actionable evidence. And that doesn't mean that they showed that a potential treatment for COVID worked. Actionable evidence is also, hey, this treatment doesn't work. That's important action to know, to not use that treatment for caring for patients. And remember that by definition, when a pandemic begins, you have no medical treatments that work. So a lot of interest over the past year, remember, in whether treatments that we had available, both treatments on the market, hydroxychloroquine and so forth, drugs that could be redirected towards COVID, drugs like remdesivir, et cetera, whether those worked or not. Only a small fraction of these trials actually were able to get off the ground quickly and effectively. And it's kind of a microcosm of some of the challenges with randomized clinical trials today. When they're well designed, when they get sufficient enrollment, when they can collect the relevant outcome data for the questions of interest, they can be very effective, but they are quite costly and they can often take a long time to complete. And if you're a busy healthcare practitioner in the midst of a pandemic, it can be really hard to put the time and effort in to conduct the actual trial. Not surprisingly, from the start with COVID, saw a lot of interest in trying to develop real world evidence. And next slide. And just because there's a lot of real world data doesn't mean we're going to be able to collect reliable evidence. Some of you may remember a couple of very high profile studies in places like Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine that were published using so-called real world data registries, this Surgisphere approach. They got a lot of attention last spring of 2020, because they essentially looked at a lot of treatments were available that people were trying out for COVID and purported to find some important results, some important indications that these treatments could help patients, and that had an immediate impact on practice. But when people looked more closely at the studies, these were peer-reviewed, published studies under fast time pressure because we're in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic. When people look more closely, like, wait a minute, what is the underlying data behind these studies? How could it be put together as quickly, cleaned up, and what exactly were the methods involved? Then some further questions, and the organization behind Surgisphere wouldn't share the data. The result was retractions, and just a reminder that just because we've got a lot of data doesn't mean we have a lot of evidence, and that there are very important methodologic considerations, both related to the data and to how the data are used, that are important to work out to have confidence in the results. And that's what I want to talk about in the rest of my these remarks. On to the next slide. So there have been many collaborative efforts to try to develop real world data and real world evidence. I'm not going to go through these in detail. They're in the slides. And if you want to learn more, these are places to go. We do a lot of work on this at Duke Margolis, Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, some other efforts like Friends of Cancer Research, had a whole series of academic conferences on the topic to try to develop these methods effectively. Next slide. Here's some of our collaborators. This is a multi-stakeholder effort, including ISPOR, on our work on developing valid methods for appropriate use of real-world data and real-world evidence. And next slide. We've done a whole series of white papers. These are available through our website. Next slide. And here's just the key things I want to emphasize is when you look at a real world data, real world evidence study, these are the big things to think about. what is the context? What kind of decision is being made? So I listed out that framework of different types of decisions. And what is the clinical context? What kind of regulatory decision, what kind of policy decision, and what are the clinical features? And that leads to informing whether the data and methods are really appropriate. And these are very important things to think about. Data considerations. Just because we have a lot of data doesn't mean we understand what those data mean. Healthcare data are notoriously complex. Remember, when you're putting together a clinical trial, you're trying to make sure that the data are very reliable and consistent. You don't have big missing data problems or noisy data problems that could bias or complicate interpreting the results. So tons of effort has actually gone into curating data, understanding data to make sure it is fit for purpose for the real world evidence study in question. And then methods consideration. Many of these studies are not randomized, but I do want to emphasize, just because a study is real world doesn't mean it can't be randomized. In fact, a lot of the slides in the supplemental deck deal with efforts to try to bring clinical trials into point of care real world context. I think it's a very promising area for further development as we get better with the data and as we bring down the costs of doing randomized trial. And so those data considerations, methods considerations are the key questions to ask when you're looking at a study, you're trying to design a study to provide valuable evidence, usable, actionable evidence in a real world setting. The next slide. FDA, with all those congressional resources and supports and direction to do more to develop in this area, has released a real world evidence framework that's based on some of those same kinds of principles. Are the data fit for use for how they're being applied? Do we really understand them? Are they missing? Is there missing elements? Are there other problems in figuring out where the data actually came from that could complicate their accuracy and their interpretation? And then second, is the trial or study design used to generate the real world evidence that takes that data and turns it into evidence? Is it providing adequate scientific evidence to answer the question involved? And then of course, for FDA, you need to make sure that these are executed right. Just because you've got the right data cleaning and data analysis procedures, just because you've got the right methods, you also need to apply those methods effectively. So effective execution or implementation of the data cleaning and data use methods and of the methods for conducting the statistical analysis, really important. So next slide. And I'm going to try to wrap up in just a couple of minutes. So some more resources. FDA is implementing major efforts around its technology modernization plan. And next slide, a data modernization plan, which is all about recognizing with petabytes of data coming in, having the data infrastructure, the tools to help make sure that the data are accurate for the purpose intended, to help make sure that the methods that are being used for real world evidence are appropriate. These are important parts of data, of FDA's data strategy. So lots of investments going on in this area now, and FDA is really trying to move this whole strategy forward by focusing on some lead examples where real world evidence could be used more effectively, could be shared more effectively. And we've got decades of experience at FDA with submitting clinical trial data for FDA to verify results and check to help firm up their regulatory review. FDA is in the process of developing that same kind of infrastructure for these vastly greater sources of real world data and potential real world evidence. Next slide. And a big agenda this year that includes releasing a lot of regulatory guidance that could help promote more effective use, dealing with those challenges that I just described around data and methods, dealing with those more effectively. This continues to be an area where all stakeholders have a lot of interest. There will be in the user fee negotiations going on right now. Those are expected to lead to some more steps in developing the real world evidence framework and hopefully, I think, including point of care randomization opportunities, randomized trial opportunities in the real world, and continued progress on the technology and data modernization plans that I just talked about. And John Concatto will hopefully talk more about this in the next session. So I'll move on from this slide. Next slide is this section is really more about advancing real world data methods and infrastructure. So it goes into more depth on some of the issues I just described. How do you know whether data are adequate? How do you know whether the methods being used are appropriate? And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into that in depth. Maybe just going forward a couple of one or two slides here. So next slide.
And Dr. McClellan, I think we're doing okay on time. If you want to,
okay.
If you want to, talk for another between 5 and 8 minutes, and then we'll have
great.
10 or so minutes for Q&A.
I come from 4 generations of fast talking Texans. I can do this all day. So just remind me when we get to the point where you've heard enough. This is one of our studies that explored the feasibility challenges of using of real world data effectively. And again, for those of you who want a little more depth, this is intended to be for policymakers, so not terribly deep in scientifically jargon and big on concept. And so the next slide, just a reminder that the credibility of an observational study for generating real world evidence can benefit from looking at whether the study could be considered adequate and well controlled. That's actually the language in FDA statute for studies. It doesn't necessarily say clinical, randomized clinical trial. And FDA considers a lot of sources of evidence and the totality of evidence that reviews for regulatory decisions. So key things are the treatment and the non-treatment groups balanced? Are they appropriate comparisons? Is the data complete? Are there missing data problems or other sources of biases? And then questions about size of effects. If the size of the effect is much, much larger, it's easier to use real world data evidence. That's why it's used for a lot of safety purposes when you're trying to detect rare events that just shouldn't happen or happening at substantially higher rates than you see in the background. Those are big effects. Unfortunately, for many medical treatments, the effect size we're looking for may be on the order of 10%, 20% reduction in a risk. And so that smaller size means you really have to get it right in terms of the underlying data and the comparisons that you're making. If we go to the next slide, just a reminder that we've seen this field really pushed along, not just in the need for real world evidence that I talked about earlier, but the approach that we take to developing clinical trials with going more digital. So now compared to just a year and a half ago, we're collecting a lot more data from patients at home using digital tools, using telehealth, telemedicine observations, and so forth. And that's opening up some more possibilities, I think, for more point of care studies that get to be more like clinical trials, but ones that are done in the real world. And next slide. And I'm going to end with this, I think, this notion of target trials. So one way to think about the data issues and the methods issues is in real world data and studies based on real world data. Could you do something like the randomized clinical trial that would give you confidence that the data are accurate and the methods are comparing two groups that really are comparable, but for the treatment they get? So what would a hypothetical trial look like? Well, there are ways of thinking through this with observational data that many researchers are now using. You're going to hear from Sebastian Schneeweiss later this afternoon. His group has done a lot of important work along these lines on understanding how, when you can't do randomization for all the kinds of reasons I talked about, you could actually get to better results. So the target trials works best where you've got two comparison groups that are otherwise similar and pretty complete data. So on to the next slide. One example of this, and this is to show you the world of real world data and real world evidence isn't all like the Surgisphere case. This is the contrast to that in COVID-19. So this was a study of a monoclonal antibody called tocilizumab, which is a drug that affects essentially the inflammatory response in seriously ill patients. And as you know, for patients who are hospitalized with COVID, that overactivation of the immune system, leading to system-wide complications and even organ failure, has been one of the big causes of deaths and associated with COVID-19. So this IL-6 monoclonal or IL-6 receptor inhibitor was suspected of maybe being beneficial. Remember, when you're trying to respond to a pandemic, you try to use the available treatments to see if they work. Well, there were some efforts to try to set up a randomized trial for tocilizumab. Those eventually got underway. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But it took a while to set them up. Providers were really, really busy. The places that had all the COVID patients were really busy under crisis level of care, almost dealing with those patients last year. So not easy to set up a randomized trial. So what was done is a lot of data, though, accumulating on those patients. And next slide, what the investigators here did was follow the key principles of a target trial. So trials have a starting point. So when does a trial start? Many observational studies compared people who got a certain treatment to a whole bunch of people who didn't, but without a starting point. So the people who didn't, may have been around for years. This is a problem with studies of like estrogen receptors some years ago. Ones who weren't getting treated all of a sudden may have been around for years, may have been doing fine. The ones who started getting treatment, maybe something happened with them, makes them inherently non-comparable. Not the way a trial is set up. There's a specific starting point where you have a decision. You're in the trial and then you're in treatment or not. So what was the trigger event here? The starting event here was a COVID patient admitted to an ICU. So it means they're very sick, and they were able to sample cases from using rich electronic health data that had a lot of information on these sick patients. They had an outcome that they could observe very reliably, so not problems with noise or the like whether or not the patients went on to get intubated, mechanical assistance with respiration, whether they died. So pretty reliable outcomes, and they matched the patients from this time zero. What's the time zero in this real world study? They matched the patients and compared outcomes, and they got a result showing a significant benefit. Tried to get the results published. This is in the aftermath of Surgisphere. Had a bit of trouble doing that. They eventually did, and when the randomized clinical trials were done, they found the same results. So this is an indication that it really matters if you can get the data right. It's complete. If you got the key covariates, so you can set up matching groups. If you can set up a study that's well designed. When did it start? What's time zero? What are the outcomes? And can you really compare similar groups? You can get to good results. And Chris, I think I'm going to stop there. There's much more in the deck related to how to maybe do more randomized trials in real world settings, which is an extremely promising area, as well as the refined methods that we're learning about to just understand the data and get the right methods that are fit for purpose for that data to answer these questions. And then, as I said, a lot of issues related to using real world data and real world evidence to improve medical practice through apps and AI and so forth. Some watch outs there that are along the same line. You got to be sure you're measuring comparable groups when you're looking at outcome and trying to say, okay, these patients should get a disease management program or extra intervention. We've had some problems with, for example, Black patients when we use data to try to decide if they should get extra interventions. If you're measuring something like their level of disease severity based on their healthcare spending, that's not the same thing as disease severity. And if they have less access to care, they're going to look healthier, and it's going to tell you the wrong answer. But there are ways to deal with those kinds of biases along the same lines I've described here. And also a lot of interest in linking real world evidence development to payment, since there's so many treatments coming along that are breakthrough treatments or accelerated approval treatments where we don't have all the answers, or even if they're not, we'd like to know long-term outcomes. We'd like to know effects in subgroups of patients. Since it matters so much, we'd like to know comparative effectiveness where these methods are really potentially effective. You just got to be careful and thoughtful about applying them. And I think there's a whole lot of potential to do that well.
Okay, thank you very much for that great overview. A lot of the things that Dr. McClellan touched on, such as subgroup analysis, will be touched on by other speakers throughout the day, and the replication studies from Sebastian Schweineiss He'll be talking about that starting at 10:45. We do have some questions coming in. The first is from Jeannie Bauman of Bloomberg Law. Dr. McClellan, can you talk a little bit about where we are with using real-world evidence for regulatory decisions and what that means about addressing some of the controversies with Biogen's Aduhelm drug for Alzheimer's?
Yeah, it's a great question. I did talk a bit about the use of real world data in regulatory decisions. So lots of use for safety studies and limited use so far, but a pathway for potential growing use for additional regulatory indications. I think that the next big area in most cases is probably not going to be the pivotal approval trials. So aducanumab, that was not a real world evidence study, and most pivotal trials for drug approvals, new drug approvals, are still randomized clinical trials. Where they can be helpful, and I think you're going to see more examples, is in so-called label expansion studies, where you've proven the basic safety and effectiveness of a drug or a medical therapy, and you have questions about well, does it work better for a long-term outcome that was harder to study in the initial approval? Does it work differently in a subgroup of patients? Companies now, there's more concern about concerns about the cost effectiveness of treatments growing. Companies that are in the same space are increasingly doing comparative studies. Well, it's really hard to do randomized trial comparisons if you're looking at small populations, because the effect size may not be that large. So having real world data where you can look at how easy one treatment is to use in routine clinical practice versus another is a good alternative. And those, by the way, are also the kinds of studies that are easier to do after a drug is approved. If there's a couple of alternatives available, or if maybe the dosing is too high, or maybe take aducanumab. Do we need to give it for a really long time, or can we just give it for 6 months or a year until plaques are gone and then stop? Don't know yet, based on the pivotal trials used for approval. But those are the kinds of things that are maybe easier to study in routine clinical practice, and certainly that practicing clinicians wanted the answer to. For aducanumab itself, I'm not going to get into the issues about process, and I think it's really important to report on those, but I hope that aducanumab reporting can also focus on what we know about the science. FDA used an accelerated approval method there. So the key question is, can we get a confirmatory study done that shows that the impact that aducanumab appears to have on plaque formation, some limited evidence of that, stronger perhaps as FDA interpreted it, at higher doses of aducanumab, does that really translate into a cognitive benefit and other benefits for patients? And those may be questions that post-market real-world evidence studies could address. You've seen a lot of payers who are reluctant to cover right now. CMS has a coverage decision open, which could, I think probably will, have some coverage with evidence development requirements in it, which would potentially build off either real-world observational analysis or maybe randomized trials that are feasible in the real world. And might say, well, the drug's approved, patients aren't going to want to be randomized to it. That's true, they might not, but maybe randomized to different doses, maybe randomized to getting treatment or getting a very good supportive care program, which is also costly. And there are some non-medical or non-pharmaceutical interventions, exercise, diet support, cognitive simulation that appear to have some benefits. That could be a real world study that's set up, as well as just applying the kinds of methods that I described to otherwise similar. There are going to be a lot of people who are going to choose not to take this drug, or their clinicians are going to recommend not taking the drug. So it's possible to set up maybe similar comparison groups there. And then finally, a lot of other drugs being developed in that class by Eli Lilly, by Roche and Genentech, by Eisai. And so we're going to learn a lot from the class effects, about the class effects of reducing plaque, whether that translates into cognitive benefit from those studies too. So a lot of both real world evidence and other clinical trials that are going to change, hopefully, the level of uncertainty that we have about the impact of these Alzheimer's disease treatments on outcomes just over the next year or two.
Okay, thank you very much. So next question is from David Lim of Politico and a former NPF fellow. How do you ensure devices used to collect real-world evidence at home are fit for regulatory decision-making?
Well, that's part of the methods development here. That's exactly the right kind of question to ask. So the devices that are used at home for sort of automated patient data capture, otherwise, there's some testing that they have to go through for FDA approval for the accuracy of the data that they're providing. I think also important for real world evidence studies is how consistently does that data get captured and reported back in? What kinds of patients are using those kinds of devices versus those that might be part of a comparison group. So that's the kind of question that the framework that I described today is exactly intended to address. And what I think FDA is going to be doing with some of the devices that it's studying, including as well as software as a sort of medical a therapeutic, is trying to get data from a initial population, and then if it looks like there's an effect, make sure it can be validated on maybe another population, a more standard population that is used to study some other similar devices and the accuracy of their data collection and the impact when you try it on a different, maybe more representative population than the particular, health system or place where you started studying it to make sure you see reliable results. I do have a little bit more of that in one of my later slides if David's interested.
Okay, good deal. I think this will have to be the last question, but early in the presentation, you talked about 34 uses of real world evidence over the time frame of, I think it was 1954 through 2020.
Yeah, 70 years-ish.
Is that scattered evenly over that time, or has that been bunched up in the last few years? And I think you touched on this, but are these are all supplemental approvals, no initial new drug?
No, these are including a number of initial approvals. So it is bunched up towards the end. So it has been increasing use, but not as much of an increase as you might expect, given all the attention. I do think that things are going to continue to ramp up if we're really thoughtful about applying about understanding the data and making sure it's fit for purpose and applying effective methods. But the original approvals are often for drugs in rare diseases where there's only a small relevant patient population, for unmet medical needs where there aren't other good treatments already available, and where in many of the cases the effect sizes are significant. So for some of the cancer drugs that have been approved in single arm trials, as using a historical comparison group against just patients who are a series of patients who are treated with a drug, if the effect size is 30, 40, 50%, well, you can be pretty confident that that's wasn't just occurring by chance if you've done a reasonably good job of what I talked about, making sure the data are complete, both for the population that you're using and the one that you're comparing it to, and that you're doing kind of match comparison methods, something like that target trial approach that I described. Where it's been a little bit more challenging is when the effect sizes aren't that large and there's really not a good alternative because the population, there's not that many patients for the rare indication. So that's why we haven't seen that many uses for new approvals. But again, I'm hopeful that as we get better at using the data and more confident with the methods, we can find ways to use them for label extension studies, maybe even for new approvals, because remember, we're getting to a more personalized era of medicine where particular treatment or combination of treatments, because we understand genomics and so forth, needs to be or should be very tailored. Hard to do really large randomized clinical trials if you only have a limited number of patients who meet all of those conditions. So maybe more uses in the future and definitely ramping up.
Okay, and I lied a second ago. We do have time for one more quick question, a follow-up question from David Lim of Politico. quick follow-up, most devices used for real-world evidence collection are not PMA devices. Should that change?
I don't think so, David. PMA is really about the risk of the device itself. So a lot of the devices that are being used, you're right, haven't been through sort of the whole clinical trial process because they're similar to products that are on the market and not a lot of safety concerns. That doesn't mean that FDA shouldn't impose some regulatory standards on new uses of the data, or new indications that could be associated with that device around outcomes. So what's really important, I think, in that case is the indication. And if you're going to use a device, whether it's a AI-enabled software program or something else to influence what doctors or patients do, how they interpret the data, there, I think these real-world methods can be very helpful.
Okay, and with that, we do need to get to a break. We're going to try to give the viewers a break in between each of the sessions so you can talk to your editors or do other business. So Dr. McClellan, I want to thank you very much for your time today, for coming on and kind of laying out the framework for us.